Alright, guys, so basically, I received some feedback from some of my friends, and they told me that they were expecting a lot more rigor from my previous videos. And, lo and behold, I decided to make a third video, right? And this one is specifically going to be addressing more towards the problem of evil, the logical problem of evil, something that I'm going to go through in a lot more thorough detail here, and I'm going to give a systematic response and objection to it, right? But first of all, I want to start this video by going through the video of our opponent once again, the person that started this discussion, and he hasn't really seen any of my videos, but that's all right. All right, we're going to give a much more rigorous response to his video again, and uh, and I hope that the systematic reply succeeds because I spent a lot of time researching this. But it's mostly arguments that I've came across before on the internet that I had to go back and recollect. Um, but yeah, but now I've compiled them in a much more fuller sense. So I'm gonna represent this to you guys in a systematic order. All right. But first, let's watch this video again, just so that we don't misrepresent him with a straw man or anything.
God cannot exist. All right, let me repeat myself because I did not say he does not exist. Although that would be true as well, he physically cannot exist within the parameters that you've set in your scriptures. Now, this God comes in many forms and depictions, even when we narrow it down to just Abrahamic religions. Christianity has almost 50,000 denominations by itself. The exact descriptions of God and what he's capable of doing vary from religion to religion, but there are always non-negotiables when it comes to God. Regardless of what you believe in, God is always described as an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. But that description itself already begins to form contradictions. For instance, if a lady was assaulted and mugged with no one other than the assailant around to intervene, does God step in? No, he doesn't. He lets it happen. So the question is why? Why does he not step in? Why does he not help the people that he so desperately wants to save? Maybe he didn't know about it, right? Then he's not omniscient. Or maybe he knew about it, but just couldn't do anything. Then he's not omnipotent. Or maybe he knew about it and had all the power to stop it, but just didn't feel like it. Then he's not omnibenevolent. I can humor you in saying that God is this and God is that, but he physically cannot have all of these three traits at once because the long list of unnecessary suffering in the world deems it so. A common thing that theists bring up in rebuttal to this is the idea of free will. Right? God chooses not to interfere because that would be effectively taking away humanity's right to choice. Now, me personally, I don't believe that we have free will, especially not if you're a theist. But even if free will did exist, my point still stands. Because I'm not here to discuss specific atrocities. I'm talking about the idea of unnecessary suffering. Now, to make my point even clearer, let me change the scenario. A newborn baby is choking on its own saliva in its sleep. The mom and dad are in the house, but they're sleeping as well. And there are nobody else to intervene and help this baby. God choosing to step in this scenario does not take away anyone's right to choice. The baby did not choose to choke. It has no concept of any of that. Even if God were to come in physical form and pull the saliva out of the baby's mouth, nothing would change. But what do we actually observe in real life? Historically speaking, God would let that baby die 100 times out of 100 times. So what makes more sense? Your perfect, mighty God allowing an innocent baby to choke and die in its sleep to prove a point, or that he simply cannot exist?
All right, so let's return. Yeah, so he gave his argument once more. I've watched this clip a couple of times, to be honest, but he gave his argument once more, and he talked about unnecessary suffering. He talked about an old lady getting mugged, and he talked about a baby choking on its own saliva, on his or her own saliva, right? So let's review it. Let's review his arguments and see if they survive the test of scrutiny. So first off, let's go have a definition. Let's revisit his definition of what God is. Yeah, this is the definition for classical theism. I'm going to skip past a few slides. You guys can pause if you want to read it, but they're less relevant and more relevant for establishing the fundamentals. Yeah, and so basically this is just a list of suffering that appears unnecessary, but I'm going to be arguing that they're actually uh, not say unnecessary, right? But they are essential for other valuable features of the world that may very well be still the case, even if we have the god of classical theism. And this is the trilemma that he's putting forth. So, a few caveats before I address his points, right? I'm not trying to justify moral suffering in the absolute sense. I'm not trying to say, oh, all moral suffering has been resolved, right? Therefore, God has to exist. I'm not saying that, right? I'm also not saying that, oh, suffering is, you need suffering, otherwise, you can't have a good character or you can't be like a good person, right? I'm not saying that, all right? That's a very ridiculous narrow purview. I'm also not saying that suffering is good, even though some religious people do think that way. Some religious people do think that way because they conflate different concepts, not by out of ignorance, not by virtue of like actually believing suffering is good. And I'm not trying to be a therapist or a psychologist here. I'm not going to be focused on consoling or comforting you if you faced any past traumatic events and want to know like um why God chose you specifically. I can't offer consolation for that. If you want consolation, you should go see a priest, you should go see a psychiatrist, psychologist. And I'm also not and I'm also attempting, but what I am attempting to do is to demonstrate that the God of classical theism can still exist in these circumstances. And if I have time, I might even be able to provide the luxury of showing you guys why there's good reason to probably believe that God of theism still exists in spite of these seemingly extenuating circumstances. So let's move on without further ado. So there are two problems with this criticism that we're receiving, right? When you say that God's omnibenevolence contradicts a world with suffering present, you're automatically assuming that when we speak of God's omnibenevolence, it's his infinite goodness. We're speaking of the same kind of goodness humans possess, right? But this is not true because human goodness is finite, right? It's not infinite. So obviously, this would be a very obvious absurdity that we reject. We do not say that God's goodness is the same thing as human goodness. Okay. Uh, the first point, on the other hand, God's omnibenevolence refers to infinite goodness. Yeah, there's no disagreement on that. We all completely agree. Okay. But what I want to clarify, what I want to specify, is that uh, when you say suffering and evil, you kind of use those two terms interchangeably, but that's not actually the case. Suffering is just a byproduct of evil. It's what arises from evil, and suffering can be categorized into like mental anguish and physical pain. But yeah, we don't affirm that it's the same thing. And I'll go into this in a lot more detail in one of the later slides, uh, as to how they're different and the parallel they strike. But first, I want to address his most compelling point, right? The one that he put a lot of rhetoric and emotion into. The baby's choking on saliva. You know, it's so evil. How can God permit something like this? Right. So this is the. By the way, this is what he said word for word. God lets babies die 100 of the time because they're choking on their saliva. And this is what we would call natural evils, which is suffering and pain caused by the physical world and natural processes rather than deliberate choice. Yeah, I know he said like the mugging incident at the start, but I'll address that later, right? I want to address this point first because this is a point that everyone found most compelling. Okay, right. So if you can already read the slides, I disagree. I disagree because God allows many things to prevent babies from choking on saliva. He allows medication. He allows free agents. You can be a bypasser walking in the park and then you see a baby choking on saliva in his stroller. And you can act on that. You can take deliberate action and save that baby. God allows for that circumstance to happen. All of the babies in their room, they're all alone. But then a passerby sees through the window, or doctors, at the hospital uh, when they're delivering the baby, then they give the parents a set of instructions on what to do and what to look out for, so that their baby doesn't accidentally choke on their saliva, and the parents follow those sets of instructions. I'm not saying that the parents are culpable. By the way, I'm not saying that they're culpable for not not focusing on everything down to the eeny weeny bitty detail, but I'm saying that God has allowed for a number of circumstances for babies to survive. And saying that God lets babies die 100 of time is just an absurd claim, right? I'm gonna obviously I don't think he's saying that God um, allows babies to die, allowed every baby to die, because well here, how could that be true? How could that be true? That's absurd. But I assume he's talking about um like God, like even the proposition he's stating here, God lets babies die 100 out of the time. Right? What about circumstances where babies get saved? He didn't let those babies die, did he? He didn't. Okay? And if he's only talking about the circumstances in which babies die, then that's so trivial. Obviously, if babies die, right? So, are you saying it's impossible for babies to die under God's purview? Like, what's the 100 out of the time? Well, what's the 100% for, right? I mean, I feel like the distinction that he's drawing, 100 every time, it's very arbitrary. I don't know the point that he's trying to get there. Okay, and also I want to make this more explicit in case I haven't already. Okay, so let me say this. Right. So yeah, he listed reasons God permits babies to choke on their own saliva. But I can just as well say God permitted a world in which the baby had functioning biological mechanisms, and where humans possess the capacity for medical knowledge, and they possess the ability for that knowledge to eventually be discovered, as seen in modern medicine. Right? And he also allowed for the possibility for caregivers to recognize choking, as I've already said. So I'm just reiterating things, right? And if, and this is the problem with what uh wait, what's his name again? Yeah, with what Unheard Sheep is putting forth. This is the main crux of the issue, right? If divine permission counts as morally significant evidence against God when it concerns the bad outcome, that is, babies choking on their own saliva, people dying in earthquakes, mothers losing their children as a result of um, natural phenomena, you need a principled reason as to why God's permission of the good producing conditions shouldn't receive corresponding consideration. Like, say, the baby is choking on his own saliva and he just self recovers, right? Nobody interacted with it. Why did you attribute that to God, right? So that's a symmetrical fatality. That's a fatal symmetry that exists in his objection. It just shows you that the objection is self-defeating. It doesn't really address uh, whether or not God can exist, right? Because God lets just as many things survive. Just God allows for just as much babies to survive. So you can't say 100 out of 100 of the time, right? Um, But now I want to go to the greater good theodicy part of it, right? Why does God let babies die in the first place? Even though it's not 100% of the time, why does he let them die in the first place? Okay, let's go through this, right? So, why does God, let me ask a more broader question. Why does God let anyone die in the first place? Why does God let people die of old age? Why does God let deers get struck by why does God let a tree get struck by lightning and the tree to fall on a innocent deer, and that deer to experience all the suffering from the tree collapsing on its legs, and hyenas start to appear and they start feasting on the deers as it's alive, and the deer is experiencing all that pain and suffering? Why does God allow for that? Right? Why does God allow for the suffering of the baby when he or she is choking on her own saliva, his or her own saliva, and they're like in excruciating pain? Why does God allow that? Why does God allow all these evils? Well, let me be very clear, right? The reason behind why God allows these evils is for very specifically uh, epistemic distance. Epistemic distance is one of them. A coherent and consistent system of nature is another reason, right? So what epistemic distance says is that God remains somewhat hidden. All right, God remains somewhat hidden intellectually and physically. And if God intervened in every circumstance where there was a choking baby, where there was a tree falling down on a deer, then his presence would be painfully obvious. Right? He permits free will as essential for humans. Wait, that's a different point, but um he cannot be so obviously present as otherwise it will be the likelihood that when humans, in recognizing his presence, would more so obey him out of sheer fear and worry of going to hell, of like uh, not being a good person, then if they were to take deliberate actions, right, and their actions be authentic, if God was so obvious to us all, we would be so scared of him. And we might diverge into irrational fear instead of being authentic with our day to day actions. So God's absence from intervening is sort of a way in which he preserves the authenticity of our actions. Because if he was so obvious, and then everybody wouldn't be so honest in the things they do. They could be doing some things just out of fear. They wouldn't be operating underneath their own free agential desires. All right. So that's one thing. Another thing is that you need a coherent system for nature. You need a system where law and order works, where the laws of logic function, where the laws of biology, the laws of physics, all of these features until a possible circumstance in which baby chokes on his or her own life. All right, and all these laws, the laws of biology, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, they're all essential for a coherent natural order, a coherent system where living creatures can abide in an ecosystem and can consume food and can participate in their day-to-day lives actively whilst having their actions preserved in authenticity. So these possibilities are all essential for these seemingly evil possibilities, seemingly emotional possibilities that we don't like to talk about, that are that appear very violent and appear very crude and disturbing, are essential underneath a coherent system, underneath a system in which the authenticity of actions are preserved. And you might be asking, well, why can't God just intervene in just one circumstance of this baby choking? Why can't God just intervene for that baby, right? And not this other baby and that other baby, or like two babies, right? Why not he just intervene in the circumstance of two babies choking, or three babies, or four babies? And he doesn't even have to make anyone realize it was him doing it. How do you know he hasn't already done that, and you just don't know it, right? So that very objection also fails. And also, even if he did that, he kept on doing that, there would still be some babies that aren't saved. And how do you know that that's the world we live in? That's what has happened. That there are some babies that aren't saved. Because when you compare what finite amount of goodness we have, the abundance of moral evils we have, right? When you compare that, you're like, oh, this world is so evil. It has so little good in it. I mean, you're comparing that obviously to an ideal world, like 100% infinite goodness of God. And no matter the small amount of natural evils you possess in this world, it will never appear small. I mean, it will never appear. It will always appear very much lacking in a lot compared to infinite goodness. That distinction between a finite set of real numbers and and the set of all natural numbers. That distinction is always going to be infinitely larger. You'll never be satisfied because your finitism entails that circumstance where you really do feel that the amount of suffering in this world is really, really large, right? It's just a consequence of any world that doesn't possess God's perfection, 100% goodness, infinite goodness. All right. Uh, And now I want to get to the dentist analogy for natural evil. So like I said, I'm doing a full-on head-on rebuttal on the logical problem of evil. All right, so let's go through the analogy of the dentist. So imagine if you were a father and you were taking your child to the dentist, and your child was like, "Oh, daddy, why do we have to go to the dentist? Why can't we just go, I don't know, eat McDonald's or go somewhere fun and pleasurable?" And your father's like, "Oh no, son, this is good for you. You gotta the dentist is good for you for scientific reason A, B, C, D, E." And then the child's like, "What? I don't understand that though," because the child's only like in third grade. He doesn't understand. He isn't able to conceive of the benefits of going to the dentist. But anyways, he enters the dentist and he trusts his father, right? And when he's undergoing tooth surgery, the doctors are drilling into his cavities, and the child's like screaming in excruciating pain. It's so painful. But you wouldn't say that that's a morally unjustified action, as in like the greater good of it isn't morally unjustified. But the suffering is definitely painful, right? The suffering is definitely something that is real, uh, something that is uh, very painful for the child. Why does the child have to go through that? To remove his cavities, to be a healthier kid. And the same thing goes for doctors when they're giving you those like really long injections and it seems really daunting at first, but then you realize it's just a vaccination and it's better for your health, right? So same thing here. God is giving us a really long and scary injection, like all this suffering are all around the world, but it's really better for you in the sense that it allows you to cultivate your virtues, right, with authenticity. It gives you the permission to take deliberate free will to make this, to overcome evil, to overcome the suffering, right, and do good, to uh, proliferate flourishing as a response to that suffering. And overcoming that suffering in this analogy is seen as something of a greater good, a second order good that arises from first order evils like pain and suffering. And intrinsically speaking, second order goods are way more valuable than first order goods, which is freedom from suffering, freedom from pain. And a good way to put this is imagine a world where it starts from good and it's just a hedonistic paradise all the way. And there's very little appreciation for what good you have because there's no evil to compare it relative to. It's like basically you don't uh it's like basically you don't really know what value is even, right? Because you've had lots of privileges your whole life, and everybody just is just enjoying their hedonistic lifestyle, and that's possible. It's possible for this world to be preserved, and there's no evil in that world whatsoever. But it gets to a point you don't understand the value of goodness. You start to become more like a philosophical zombie, right? There's just an all good, no autonomy puppet, no autonomy puppet, first of all. And secondly, when you compare it to a world that starts off from way less good, which is much more deficient, and grows into a world of greater good, which world generates more goodness? Now, obviously, for the sake of illustrating the argument, not for the sake of illustrating the argument, but intuitively, the second role makes more sense when it comes to generating good. When you go from a state of less good and then you start growing towards maximal goodness, right? You start approaching maximal goodness. Whereas if you were starting on a straight line and you were just moving along the gradient at a static state of goodness, yeah, the dynamic wall, going to greater, approaching maximum goodness, would generate way more goodness, right? It would generate way more goodness, and that goodness would be way more valuable. So that stands for God, right? Why God permits evil, so that He can draw society from a state of impoverishment to much more state of maximal goodness. All right. So that's the dentist analogy, and that's why the logical problem of evil fails. Because God can have morally justified reasons for allowing evil to exist, And that evil need not necessarily be unnecessary, right? As I've already shown how the baby choking on saliva could be necessary for more apparent natural laws and natural orders, as well as preserving the authenticity of human actions. I've already shown that. So let's go on. Next, we come to his analogy of a lady getting mugged, and he admits that free will answers this. At least that's what I think he's referring to. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense for him to categorize unnecessary suffering for a lady getting mugged. But when it comes to deliberate human actions, we don't say it's the same thing as God permitting evil, right? Because there is a genuine injustice that needs to be resolved. Much like a tyrant is like harming a bull, and we need someone to step in. And what I'd say to this, right, is transworld depravity. That for every world God creates, every world with three persons, there is at least one morally evil act that a person can commit, that a person will commit. There is at least one, right, for any world in which uh, God creates. And this is a possible hypothesis. So this is another defeater to the logical problem of evil, because you can't tell me, like, you can't say it's impossible that there's at least one morally evil action to be committed in a world with morally free creatures, right? And also, as I've stated earlier, the gap between a finite amount of goodness and an infinite amount of goodness God is always going to be infinitely large. So you're always going to see all sorts of seemingly extenuating circumstances. That doesn't necessarily prove that God doesn't exist. That could just mean that the gap between the two are so large. The gap between what ought to be done and what really is the case. All right, that's what we call evil. We list it as a privation. So now we have some time left over. I want to go through something very important, the reverse problem of evil. So people often talk about evil, especially atheologians, atheists, like the one I'm responding to, Unheard Sheep. But evil presupposes something very important, right? Earlier, I already established that evil is a privation, it's a lack of goodness. But the thing is, right? With evil, not only do you presuppose the pre-existence of some good that already existed, right? But you're also saying that there's, like, think of goodness as a coin, and then evil is a counterfeit coin, right? So the presence of a counterfeit coin establishes the presence of the good of a coin that was already pre-existent. And the problem lies in, like, what's the origin of goodness, right? Is it just some arbitrary substance that arose from nowhere, or is it actually something there's much more that comes from God, that is God? And I stick with the latter case, that it is God, goodness is God. Though you understand absolute divine simplicity, you understand what I mean by God is goodness. But more specifically, when we talk about evil, we're just saying that there's a lack of God in this thing, right? There's a lack of God present in this thing. But that doesn't, like I said, as I've been reiterating multiple times, that doesn't disprove God's existence. And also, right. Also, I forgot what is it I wanted to address. I think it was to do with I think it was to do with God's divine justice. Huh. But yeah, the my point here, the reverse POE, is that if you're going to use a lot of evil to argue against God, I mean, evil already presupposes. Oh yeah, yeah. Now I remember. Evil already presupposes that there's a good, right? And that good has an origin to it. And if you want to argue that there's a good, then if you want to argue that there's such a thing as evil, as something that is so compelling, something that is so um so atrocious is evil that that it's so bad. It's just this big bad thing that is so big that it just renders God into non-existence, the God of classical theism into non-existence. And you're holding to, I think, a really inconsistent view because you're presupposing this large amount, this thing called evil, that is a really big gap in our morals. There's a really big gap in the wall, all the suffering, all the pain, and you're saying, oh, therefore God doesn't exist, right? But the thing about this is, if you're treating evil as a real thing, from where did that evil arise? If you're treating it as a real thing. And to this, I say that the theist has a much more plausible account of evil, and that we say that evil is a real thing because it's a lack of a real thing, right? Therefore, it's a real circumstance. It's possible to have evil because you have a lack of good. You really do have a lack of good, and that good comes from God, and you have a lack of God. But for the critic, where does this evil arise? Is it just some magical substance that is floating in the air that just, I don't know, that we can't see or touch? Like not a physical substance like a gaseous state, but like an immaterial substance that is just like that we can't control. Like you start to see that the opposition, the contrary, evil as some arbitrary law, arbitrary substance, is very inconsistent. It's very absurd. It's like um, it's like goodness without God. So in this sense, my the opponent who's bringing up this objection, the problem of evil, he's using evil to stir such an emotional ruckus out of his viewers. But he doesn't like he can't even argue for evil independent of God, right? Without without collapsing into some absurd arbitrary without collapsing into putting in some absurd arbitrary presets or placeholders so that he can establish the existence of evil, right? And that's totally fine. He can reject the existence of evil because it's very difficult to justify the existence of. But then he runs into an issue, right? If you're just saying that, evil is just evil is just molecules interacting, then mm, then there really isn't any ought to be done, right? There really isn't any such thing as good either, right? Good is just molecules interacting. All right. Then when it comes down to epistemic facts, and I know this is going more into moral realism, but I just want to get this out there. When it comes to epistemic facts, like, oh, then why do you ought to correct people on their critical thinking? Uh, why do you ought to do things that you think inform religious people on their beliefs? If good to you is all just relative, if evil to you is all just relative, how do their acts warrant any actions? And you could make any kind of excuse for yourself. You could say, oh, because they're reducing the free will of their children, they're indoctrinating the children. But you just admitted that evil is relative, right? You just admitted that it's just molecules interacting. So why are you overriding their culture, if your objective standard of evil doesn't even root well. So not only does he have to give an account for evil on his part, he also has to show why his account of evil survives the scrutiny that he applies to God. And if he doesn't want to do any of those, he has to show why moral realism is false. So he has so many burdens, right? But I'll say that if he's working with a cumulative case against God's existence by the reverse problem of evil, I mean by the evidential problem of evil, I can just pull the reverse problem of evil and talk about, oh, if you can use evil as a reason as to why God cannot exist, why can't I use the abundance of goodness, like Rosa Parks standing against the protest, standing against standing up against others, right, in a bus? Or why can't I use like the overcoming of apartheid by Nelson Mandela as reason for God's existence? Because all these are good features as well. Why can't I do that? So I feel like evidential problem of evil suffers from a symmetry unless you go into animal suffering. But animal suffering isn't something that he addresses. I don't think he's even aware of it. And on top of reverse POE, I can also bring in the cosmological fine-tuning argument, which is that, oh, the constants are so precise. Like this is more expected under a worldview of theism than it is atheism. And yeah, there's just so many arguments that I could give to show you why the God of classical theism is a rational one. And I don't think he's as committed as as investigating. I don't think he's entirely honest with his investigation. He's just doing it for the clicks and views. Like if you watch my videos, they have very little clicks and views because I'm not doing it for the clicks and views. I'm doing it for the intellectual content and showing you why your arguments don't actually succeed. So I think this is a very loose commitment of his, something that he needs to address in more detail. So I hope I gave a very clear and systematic response to his argumentation. Um, I hope you guys enjoyed this video most of all. I really love you guys watching this. I put a lot of effort into this video. By the way, I spent a lot of time. But anyways, peace out, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.